There are stories the earth keeps buried, stories that seep through soil like blood through cloth, staining everything they touch. In the summer of 1853, the cotton fields of Tennessee stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, their white bowls hanging like the eyes of the dead. The heat pressed down like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Cicadas screamed from every branch, their voices rising and falling in waves that sounded almost human, almost like crying. The enslaved workers moved through the rows with bent backs and calloused hands, their own voices carried in hushed tones that seemed to disappear the moment they left their lips. Among them walked Louisa. She was not like the others. Where they sang to make the work bearable, she remained silent. Where they spoke in quick, nervous clusters during the brief moments when the overseer's eye turned away, she kept her own counsel. Her footsteps made no sound on the dusty earth, as if she had learned to walk between worlds. The other workers noticed. How could they not? In a place where every breath was watched, every movement scrutinized, silence was a dangerous luxury. A slave who does not sing, the white folks whispered, is a slave with thoughts too dark to voice. But Louisa's silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of secrets that seemed to press against her skin from the inside, threatening to spill out like water from a cracked vessel. Her eyes held the weight of knowing things that others could only sense in their dreams. In the evenings, when the work bell rang and the others collapsed into exhausted sleep, Louisa would sit by the window of the quarters, her sewing basket beside her. She would take out her needle, always the same one, worn smooth by countless hours of use, and prick her finger. Just once. Just enough for a single drop of blood to well up, dark as molasses in the lamplight. The others watched. From the corners of their eyes, they saw how she would study that drop of blood, tilting her finger this way and that, as if reading something written there in crimson ink, as if the needle itself were alive, whispering secrets that only she could hear. "That girl ain't right," old Martha would mutter, pulling her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Ain't natural, the way she carries herself. Like she knows something the rest of us don't." And perhaps she did. The big house loomed over them all like a white-painted monument to cruelty. Its windows gleamed yellow in the dying light, casting long shadows across the fields where so many had labored and died. Inside, the master's family lived their lives of comfort, built on foundations of suffering, never knowing that among the bent backs in their fields walked someone who understood that revenge, like cotton, grows slowly in the dark earth. Louisa would finish her evening ritual and put away her needle, wrapping it carefully in a piece of cloth that was always stained, no matter how many times she washed it. The stains were the color of rust, or dried blood, or something else entirely, something that had no name but plenty of power. As the last light faded from the Tennessee sky, she would close her eyes and listen. Not to the cicadas or the distant laughter from the big house, but to something deeper, something that whispered through the cotton bowls like wind through bones. The earth was patient. The earth remembered everything. And sometimes when the time was right, the earth demanded payment. In her silence, Louisa was learning to speak its language. The next morning would bring new work, new pain, and new opportunities. But tonight, in the space between darkness and dawn, something was stirring in the cotton fields of Tennessee. Something that would soon make itself known in ways the big house could never imagine. The big house had rules, unspoken, but understood, carved into the consciousness of everyone who dwelled within its shadow. The enslaved were to be seen, but not truly noticed, heard only when spoken to, present only when needed. But Louisa had found her way into the spaces between these rules. Her fingers, those same fingers that pricked themselves nightly in her quarters, were deemed skilled enough for the delicate work that the mistress demanded. Embroidery on fine linens, repairs to silk gowns, the mending of clothes that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. She worked in a small room off the main hall, where afternoon light filtered through lace curtains and fell across her lap like benediction. Here, surrounded by spools of thread and baskets of fabric, Louisa's silence took on a different quality. Here, it felt deliberate, calculated. The White family found her quiet, unnerving. "She never hums," the mistress confided to her sister during one of their afternoon teas. "Not even the spirituals the others sing. Just nothing. It makes my skin crawl." But they couldn't argue with her skill. Every stitch was perfect, every repair invisible. The embroidered roses she worked into the pillowcases bloomed with such lifelike detail that guests would swear they could smell their perfume. What they didn't know was that sometimes, late in the evening when the house settled into sleep, Louisa would return to that small room. She would light a single candle and spread her real work across the table, not the pretty embroidery that pleased the mistress, but something far older, far more dangerous. Small cloth pouches, sewn with threads that seemed to absorb the candlelight, rather than reflect it. Herbs gathered from the edges of the plantation, where the cultivated land gave way to wild things that grew without permission. Plants that the older women had taught her to recognize by touch, by smell, by the way they made her fingertips tingle. Pokeweed berries, dried and ground to powder. Roots from the castor bean plant. Leaves from the white snake root that grew in. The shadowed places where even the overseers feared to walk. She would work these into her thread, soaking cotton strands in tinctures that had no name in any language the white folks would recognize. The thread would dry, appearing normal, feeling normal. Only she could detect the faint, bitter scent that clung to it like morning mist. Her hands bore the evidence of this work. Stains that went deeper than skin, marking her palms with patterns that looked almost like root systems or branching veins. She wore gloves now when she worked in the big house, claiming her hands had grown sensitive to the summer heat. The master's son noticed first. "Why does that girl always smell like dirt?" he asked his mother one afternoon, wrinkling his nose. As Louisa passed through the parlor with an armload of mended shirts, the mistress paused in her needlepoint, considering. There was indeed something earthy about Louisa's presence. Something that reminded her of turned soil after rain, of root cellars and deep forest shadows. But good seamstresses were hard to find, and Louisa's work was flawless. So the mistress simply instructed her servants to ensure all the windows were opened wide when Louisa was working. "For the circulation," she said. What none of them understood was that some knowledge runs deeper than schooling. That the women who had raised Louisa in the quarters carried wisdom passed down through generations, wisdom born of necessity, of survival, of the desperate mathematics of the powerless. They had taught her which plants could heal and which could harm, how to prepare them, how to hide them, how to wait. Most importantly, they had taught her patience. In the sewing room, surrounded by the trappings of wealth built on suffering, Louisa worked with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that real power often came disguised as service. Her needle moved in and out of fabric like a heartbeat, each stitch a small promise, each repair a tiny act of preparation. The White family saw only a quiet girl making their clothes beautiful. They had no idea she was making them ready for death. Outside, the cotton continued to grow, row upon row, white and endless under the August sun. And in the small sewing room, Louisa continued her own cultivation, tending a different kind of crop entirely. August in Tennessee was a month of reckoning. The cotton hung heavy on its stalks, ready for harvest. The air itself seemed to pulse with heat and humidity, thick enough to drown in. And in the big house, small signs began to appear that something had shifted in the delicate balance between comfort and catastrophe. It started with the master's Sunday shirt. He put it on that morning as he had 100 times before, the crisp white cotton fresh from Louisa's careful mending. But within minutes of settling into his pew at the church, he began to scratch. Subtle at first, a finger drawn absently across his collar, a brief adjustment of his cuff. By the time the preacher reached his conclusion about divine justice, the master's neck was red and angry, welts rising like tiny mountains across his skin. His wife cast worried glances in his direction as he struggled not to claw at himself in full view of the congregation. Probably just the heat, the family doctor declared when called to examine the angry rash that had spread across the master's chest and arms. Summer brings out these irritations. I'll prescribe a cooling salve. But the salve brought no relief. If anything, the condition worsened, the welts weeping and crusting over like wounds that refused to heal. The master took to wearing his coat even in the stifling heat, trying to hide the evidence of his body's rebellion. 3 days later, it was young Mary's turn. The child had been delighted with the dress Louisa had altered for her, let out in the waist where she was growing, the hem lengthened to accommodate her increasing height. The pale yellow fabric had been embroidered with tiny white flowers, delicate as snowflakes. She wore it to her piano lesson, preening in front of the mirror like any 8-year-old girl would. But halfway through her scales, she began to cough. Soft at first, then more insistent. By evening, the cough had settled deep in her chest, rattling like bones in a bag. "It's just the dust from the cotton harvest," her mother insisted, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "All that debris in the air. She'll be fine." But Mary was not fine. The cough persisted for days, keeping the household awake with its harsh, barking sound. During the day, she would run fever, her small face flushed and damp with perspiration. At night, she would shiver despite the summer heat, pulling her blankets up to her chin with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. The mistress herself began to notice peculiarities with her own warments. A lingering odor in her evening gowns, not unpleasant exactly, but strange, herbal, wild, like the scent that sometimes drifted up from the quarters when the wind was right, carrying with it hints of unfamiliar cooking, unfamiliar rituals. She mentioned it to her lady's maid, a nervous woman who had served the family for nearly a decade. "Do you smell that?" the mistress would ask, holding up a freshly laundered dress. "Something earthy?" But the maid, whose nose was perhaps less sensitive than her mistress's, smelled nothing unusual. "Perhaps it's the soap, ma'am. We've been using a different lye this season." In the slave quarters, whispers traveled like smoke through the close-packed rooms. The women spoke in voices so low, they barely disturbed the air, but their meaning was clear to those who knew how to listen. "That girl's got the knowing," old Sarah murmured, her gnarled fingers working at a tear in her skirt. "Seen it in her hands, seen it in the way she carries herself." Some feared what Louisa might be doing. They understood the terrible mathematics of their situation. If she was discovered, it wouldn't be just her who paid the price. The master's wrath would fall on all of them, collective punishment for individual transgression. But others felt a different emotion stirring in their chests, something that tasted almost like hope. They watched the big house with new eyes, noting the drawn curtains in the master's bedroom, the worried conversations that drifted from the kitchen, the way the mistress had begun to move through her days. With less certainty, more caution, the family called for more doctors, specialists from Memphis, a professor from Nashville who claimed expertise in mysterious ailments. They came with their black bags and confident diagnoses, prescribing treatments that seemed to make everything worse. "Perhaps it's something in the water," one suggested. "The miasma from the swamps," proposed another. "Bad humors in the blood," brought on by the heat. None of them thought to examine the clothes themselves. None of them considered that death might come not in dramatic poison or midnight murder, but woven into the very fabric of daily life, patient as a spider in its web. In her small sewing room, Louisa continued her work, the same steady rhythm, the same perfect stitches. But now, when she pricked her finger for that nightly drop of blood, she would smile, just barely, just enough to curve the corners of her mouth. The harvest was beginning. Soon, the cotton would be picked, processed, shipped away to distant mills where it would be transformed into cloth for people who would never know the cost of its growing. But before that happened, there would be another kind of harvest. One that had been planted in silence and tended with needle and thread. By late August, the big house had taken on the quality of a tomb. Windows that once gleamed with pride now remained shuttered against the light. Rooms that had echoed with laughter and conversation fell silent, except for the sound of labored, breathing and muffled coughs. The sickness had spread like spilled ink across parchment, touching every member of the master's family with its dark influence. The master himself had grown gaunt, his once robust frame now sharp with angles that his clothes could no longer disguise. The rash that had started with his Sunday shirt had never fully healed, leaving his skin mottled and sensitive. He could no longer bear the touch of certain fabrics against his flesh, and took to wearing only the oldest, softest garments he possessed, clothes that predated Louisa's careful attentions. His wife fared little better. The mysterious scent that had troubled her had evolved into something more sinister, a constant taste of metal in her mouth, a persistent headache that pulsed behind her eyes like a second heartbeat. She complained that food had lost its flavor, that even her favorite rose-scented soap now smelled of decay. Young Mary's cough had settled into her chest like a living thing, growing stronger while she grew weaker. The family physician had tried every remedy in his arsenal: hot poultices, bitter tinctures, steam tents that filled her room with aromatic vapors. Nothing helped. If anything, the treatment seemed to agitate her condition, leaving her more restless, more hollow-eyed. Other children showed their own symptoms. 12-year-old James developed a tremor in his hands that made writing impossible. 10-year-old Catherine began having nightmares so vivid she would wake screaming, though she could never remember what had frightened her so terribly in her sleep. Doctors came and went like shadows. They brought their theories and their treatments, their confident diagnoses that crumbled in the face of the family's persistent decline. One suggested a change of climate, perhaps the mountains, where the air was cleaner. Another recommended a complete purge of the household's diet, suspecting contamination in the food stores. None of them thought to examine what lay closest to their patient's skin. The enslaved community watched this transformation with a mixture of fear and fascination. They went about their daily tasks, cooking, cleaning, tending the grounds, but always with an awareness of the change that had settled over their world like morning fog. In the kitchen, the cook found that meals prepared for the big house often went uneaten. The mistress would take a few bites, then push her plate away with a grimace. The master picked at his food like a bird, consuming barely enough to sustain life. "They're wasting away," whispered the house servants to each other. All of them, like something's eating them from the inside. But it was more than physical decline that had transformed the big house. The very atmosphere seemed poisoned. Conversations that once flowed easily now faltered and died. Family members moved through the halls like ghosts haunting their own lives, avoiding each other's company as if proximity itself carried some contagion. The master, once given to explosive rages that terrified the entire household, now seemed too weary for anger. He would stare out his bedroom window at the cotton fields for hours, his eyes unfocused, as if he were trying to see something that remained perpetually just beyond his vision. His wife took to her bed more often than not, claiming fatigue, though. She did nothing but rest. She would lie in the dim room, surrounded by the beautiful things that had once brought her pleasure: silk curtains, embroidered pillows, delicate lace coverlets, and find no comfort in any of them. The children, once loud and boisterous, now spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. They played quiet games in shadowed corners, as if afraid that too much noise might attract the attention of whatever dark force had taken residence in their home. Visitors began to avoid the plantation entirely. Word had spread through the county's social circles that the family was unwell, though no one could say exactly what ailed them. Invitations to social gatherings went unanswered. The Sunday pew that had once showcased the family's prosperity now stood empty week after week. Only Louisa remained unchanged. She continued her work in the small sewing room, her needle moving with the same steady precision it always had. But now, when she walked through the halls of the big house, she seemed to carry a different quality of silence. Not the fearful quiet of the oppressed, but something deeper. Something that felt almost like satisfaction. The stains on her hands had darkened, spreading up her wrists like ivy climbing a wall. She made no effort to hide them now, wearing them like badges of honor. When the mistress was too ill to notice, when the master was lost in his window-staring stupor, Louisa would allow herself the smallest of smiles. Outside, the cotton harvest had begun. The fields buzzed with activity as workers moved through. The rows, their bags growing heavy with the white gold that had built this empire of suffering. But in the big house, a different kind of harvest was reaching its culmination. Death, it seemed, could be patient. It could work slowly, carefully, weaving itself into the fabric of daily life until it became indistinguishable from normalcy, and sometimes death could come wearing the face of justice. Fear, when it finally comes, arrives like lightning, sudden, brilliant, and impossible to ignore. It struck the big house on a September morning when the mist still clung to the cotton fields like the breath of ghosts. The master's wife, weakened by weeks of illness, but driven by a desperate need for answers, had dragged herself from her sickbed to conduct a search, not for medicine or comfort, but for explanations. She started in the pantry, examining every jar and container for signs of contamination. Then the well water, the stored grain, the milk house. But it was young James, still trembling from the palsy that had overtaken his hands, who remembered seeing something strange. "The sewing woman," he whispered to his mother, his voice barely audible. "I saw her in the herb garden, picking things that weren't vegetables, putting them in her apron." The mistress felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Within the hour, Louisa found herself standing in the front parlor, facing the entire family. What remained of them, anyway. The master slouched in his chair like a scarecrow, his clothes hanging loose on his wasted frame. The mistress gripped the mantelpiece for support, her knuckles white with effort. The children huddled together on the settee, their eyes wide with the fever brightness of the chronically ill. "Show us your hands," the mistress commanded, her voice cracking with strain. Louisa extended her arms, palms up. The stains were darker now, almost black in places, spreading up her wrists like ink in water. They formed patterns that looked almost deliberate, spirals and lines that could have been script in some long-forgotten language. "What are those marks?" The master's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of dawning horror. Louisa said nothing. She had never been given to explanations, and she would not start now. Her silence stretched through the room like a held breath, gaining weight and substance with each passing second. The overseer was summoned, a hard man with hands like leather and eyes that had seen too much cruelty to be moved by more. He examined Louisa's workspace, her quarters, the small cloth pouches she had sewn with such care. "Herbs," he announced, holding up a sachet that smelled of earth and secrets. "Strange ones, nothing I recognize from any garden." But it was the thread that truly damned her. Spools of cotton that looked ordinary until you held them to the light, until you noticed the way they seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. Thread that carried a scent of wild places and forbidden knowledge. "You poisoned us," the mistress accused, though her voice carried more wonder than rage. "You've been poisoning us all along, with your sewing." Still, Louisa remained silent. She stood straight-backed in the center of the room, her dark eyes moving from face to face with a composure that seemed impossible under the circumstances. There was no fear in her expression, no guilt, no remorse. If anything, she looked complete. As if this moment had been the destination toward which every day of her life had been leading. The master struggled to his feet, swaying with the effort. "Why?" he gasped. "Why would you do this to us? We treated you well. Better than field hands. You had work inside, away from the sun." For the first time in memory, Louisa spoke. Her voice was soft, musical, with an accent that carried traces of languages older than English. "Better than field hands," she repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. "Better than beasts, but never better than human." The silence that followed was different from her usual quiet. This was the silence of understanding dawning, of terrible truths finally brought to light. The family looked at her with new eyes, seeing not the obedient seamstress, but something far more dangerous. A woman who had learned that patience, applied correctly, could be the sharpest weapon of all. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on Sao, the horizon promising an end to the long, dry summer. And in the parlor of the big house, another kind of storm was about to break. Some stories refuse to die. They sink into the soil like blood, seeping through generations until truth and legend become indistinguishable, woven together like threads in a tapestry too dark to fully comprehend. What became of Louisa? The records speak in whispers, if they speak at all. Some say they found her at dawn, hanging from the old oak behind the big house, the same tree where so many others had met their end. Her sewing basket scattered beneath her feet, needles glinting like tiny daggers in the morning. Light. The rope around her neck, they claimed, was sewn with her own thread, each stitch perfect even in death. But others tell a different tale. They say she simply vanished. One night she was there in the quarters, silent as always, her needle catching the lamplight. The next morning, her bed was empty, her basket gone. Only the smell remained, that strange herbal scent that had clung to her workspace, now lingering in the air like a final breath. The master's family. They recovered slowly, mysteriously. The sickness that had plagued them for weeks lifted like morning fog, leaving them weak but alive. The doctors proclaimed it a miracle. The enslaved community knew better. They understood that some vengeance has its own timing, its own mercy. In the quarters, Louisa's story began to change. Children who had never seen her claimed they remembered her face. Women who had barely spoken to her swore they knew her secrets. The tale grew with each telling, twisting and reshaping itself like fabric on a loom. "She walks the cotton fields. Still," the old ones would whisper. "When the moon is dark and the cicadas fall silent, you can see her moving between the rows, needle in hand, thread trailing behind her like smoke." They said the clothes she had sewn, the ones that remained in the big house, were never worn again. Too dangerous, the mistress claimed, though she could never explain why. Those garments hung in wardrobes like ghosts, gathering dust and secrets in equal measure. Years passed. The plantation changed hands. The big house was sold, abandoned, eventually claimed by kudzu and time. But the stories persisted, passed down, in hushed voices from mother to child, grandmother to granddaughter. Was Louisa a poisoner, a witch, a woman driven to desperate measures by desperate times? The truth dissolved into folklore, becoming something larger than fact, more powerful than history. Because sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is not the blade or the poison, it is the story itself. The whisper that survives when the whisperer dies. The legend that grows in the spaces where official records fear to tread. Even now, they say, when cotton grows wild in abandoned fields across Tennessee, you might catch the scent of strange herbs on the wind. You might see a shadow moving purposefully through the white bowls, silent as death, patient as the earth itself. And if you look closely, very closely, at the way the cotton grows, you might notice it forms patterns. Stitches in the landscape. Threads connecting past to present, memory to reality. Louisa's needle, it seems, never stopped weaving. Her silence, after all, had found its voice.